In May of 1787, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia. It was ostensibly called to make changes in the Articles of Confederation, but very quickly the delegates there realized that this was not going to be possible. And the Articles of Confederation were taken off the table and a new government was proposed. That new government will be finally approved by this convention in September of 1787, eventually ratified by the states, and becomes the Constitution under which we function today. But that's jumping ahead of the game. First, let's talk a little bit about this Constitutional Convention. It's probably not like you're thinking, where everybody all met at once. The delegates are arriving, coming and going throughout the summer of 1787. Sometimes a state might have 3 or 4 representatives, sometimes down to 2 or 3 as others leave. Sometimes states are unrepresented altogether. Maryland, for example, Rhode Island, for example, never sends anybody. Okay, they're entirely unrepresented throughout the Constitutional Convention. But the people that are there recognize very quickly that they need a new government. Let's talk about some of these people. They are not people that are unknown to running the government. The average age was 42, which seems perhaps old if you're watching this as a college student. But if you think about it, if you were to say take the average age of every cabinet member, of the president, of congressmen, and the Supreme Court, my guess is you'd come up with a number significantly above 42. 42 is pretty young, but these men were not inexperienced. They had been around through the Revolution. They had served in the Congress of the Confederation. They'd been state governors, etc. They are led by George Washington. He is the chairman, the president of this convention. He does not play a major role in terms of ideas or things like that, but here's why George Washington is important. He is the fundamental American. As one of his biographers have put it, he was the indispensable man. He is the general that led us in our American Revolution, who won our freedom from England, and it is imperative that he endorse this new government. It simply will not sell without Washington's stamp of approval. So putting him at the head of the table, allowing him to be the chair of the convention, is a very, not even very subtle ploy to make sure that this gets popular approval. The main thinker, probably the man who has most of the ideas and who takes the best notes at this convention, is James Madison. He's a young man. He's in his mid-30s. He's a small guy. Depending on whether or not people liked him or didn't like him, tended to disparage his height, but he's somewhere around 5'2" to 5'4", and frankly weighs about 100 pounds, dressing in black, sort of a sickly Johnny Cash kind of figure. But he is there every day. He's writing everything down, and he is in many ways the brains behind the Constitution. Another guy who's there is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is old. He is in his late 80s. He is not well. Often he will have to be carried in on a litter. And he is there, again, not as somebody who provides a lot of brilliant ideas, but he plays a role in much the same way as Washington played a role. If Washington plays the role of being that guy that has to be the face of this to give it his approval, Benjamin Franklin is somebody who brings a great deal of perspective to the Constitutional Convention. He's one that has that Poor Richard's Almanac wit still, that can, when there's a lot of tension or frustration or the debate is getting a little too hot, can gain the floor and make some witty comment that just kind of calms everybody down. So he plays a role that maybe isn't instrumental in terms of writing the Constitution, but maybe his role is as a guidance counselor, if you will. Another guy who's there, Elbridge Gerry. He is from Massachusetts. And he is sort of the opposite of Benjamin Franklin. If Benjamin Franklin was that guy that always had something funny to say or witty to say that kind of put everybody in a gentle spirit, Elbridge Gerry is the guy that doesn't like anything. He complains about everything that is suggested. But his role is important too, because he makes every delegate think through every possible angle. Anytime an idea is brought up, Elbridge Gerry is there to attack it and challenge it and make sure your thinking is in play. Well, these are just a few. There's many others, 55 total come and go. But these are the men largely responsible for putting together a document based upon certain principles. And again, flash back to our lecture one, we talked about English political thinking. There are certain principles that these men believe, and they are going to define certain ways of thinking in the American political context based upon what they believe to be true. And one of the things they believe to be true is that America needs a Republican form of government. Now, I don't mean Republican versus Democrat. What I mean is a Republican form of government where people are represented by others. Okay, we often use the terms republic and democracy interchangeably, and that's fine, but it's a little bit sloppy in that a democracy is a government where everybody represents themselves. We don't do that. We're a country that's far too large for that. We're a republic where we elect people to represent us. And this is foundational. Foundational is the belief that America needs to be a republic where there need to be people that represent other people. There needs to be separation of powers. Again, this goes back to English political thought, the idea that there should not be one person in charge of everything. We need to divide the government. We need to have a legislative branch to make laws, an executive branch to enforce laws, a judicial branch to interpret those laws. And those laws, or those branches rather, need to be separate. There need to be different people there. They will be interconnected. There will be some overlap, but it needs to be separate. The powers of making laws, enforcing laws, and interpreting and applying the laws need to be in different hands. And a third basic principle is this idea of federalism. And this was, again, something that the Americans brought to them out of their English political context of a parliament in England that ruled an empire, as well as colonial governments that ruled the colonies. It is clear that we need a national government. But it's also clear that we need state governments and, in fact, local governments. And that's the idea of federalism. If separation of powers is the notion of dividing power between branches of government, then federalism is the notion of dividing power between levels of government. So you have a national level of government, a state level of government, and a local level of government. And with each of those levels, you have separation of powers. So for example, at the national level, you have an executive branch made up of a president, a legislative branch made up of Congress, and a judicial branch made up of the Supreme Court. At the state level, that's the governor, state legislature, and state Supreme Court. At the local level, it's a mayor, a city council, and a municipal court. And this is a very sophisticated way of running your government and a very common sense way as well, because let's face it, do we really want Congress to have to decide where a city can put up a light pole or a stop sign? And on the other hand, does each community need its own Air Force? You know, these are absurdities. Obviously, there are some things that the national government needs to do, like national defense, and there are some things that local governments can do, like regulate traffic laws. So these are some basic principles that all the men understood. That doesn't mean that they got along well. This is a very contentious series of meetings over that summer in 1787. And one of the first issues that they had to deal with was the idea of representation in Congress. A delegate from Virginia named Randolph proposes what becomes known as the Virginia Plan. And key to this plan of new governing, again, we're throwing the Articles of Confederation away, we're starting from scratch. The key to this plan, the Virginia Plan, was that representation in Congress be based on population. That is to say, these large states like Virginia were frustrated with the fact that they had the same vote in Congress as a small state like Rhode Island or Delaware. You could send as many delegates as you wanted, as you could afford, but you got one vote for your state. And states like Virginia were frustrated with that. So the Virginia Plan suggests that states have a representation in Congress based upon their population. If Virginia has 10 times as many people as Delaware, it deserves 10 times as many votes. Well, this is countered almost immediately by a delegate from New Jersey, a small state, with what comes to be known, not surprisingly, as the New Jersey Plan. This is a plan, essentially, to say, we want to keep it the same. We want equality in Congress. We want each state to have an equal number of votes. What the small states feared was an idea known as the tyranny of the majority. And let me explain that to you just real quick. What that meant was the small states argued that if we are always going to be outvoted, what difference does it make that we vote? In other words, if there are always going to be 10 delegates from Virginia and 1 delegate from New Jersey, whenever something's brought up, the New Jersey delegate is never going to get his way, so you might as well be a tyrant. It doesn't matter that we vote if we can never win an election. That's what they were afraid of. So they proposed the New Jersey plan. Now this is a dynamic that goes back and forth for quite a few days in the Congress, and it is a point of such contention that it seems like it might break the convention apart. Finally, a compromise is reached, and it's known simply as the Great Compromise. It's proposed by a guy from Connecticut, so you might see it in your books as the Connecticut Compromise as well, but it's usually known as the Great Compromise. And what this Great Compromise was the rather obvious solution of let's give everybody what they want. Let's stop thinking of Congress as being one thing, and let's think of it as two things. Let's think of it as a House of Representatives, where voting will be based upon population, and a Senate where every state gets the same votes. And that's the way it works today. In the House of Representatives, California, I believe, has 53 representatives, and a small, less populated state like Wyoming gets 1. But in the Senate, California has 2 senators, and so does Wyoming. That, however, created another problem. If all of a sudden we are going to have voting in one of the parts of Congress based on population, what do we do with slaves? If the first tension was between large states and small states, this second tension is between northern and southern states. Because southern states say, great, since voting is based upon population, we get to count all of our slaves. And northern delegates say, no, those are property. Those aren't people. They have no civil rights. You own them, you buy them, you sell them. You have no more right to count your slaves than we have to count our horses. Southern delegates respond with, no, they're human beings, they're people, they get to count. And this tension goes back and forth until it is resolved with what is called the 3/5 compromise. And again, it's a pretty simple solution to understand. They're going to simply count 3/5 of the southern slaves. So if you have 100,000 slaves, you get to count that as if it were 60,000 extra people in your population. This will give them a bit of representation, but not everything that they wanted. A third issue that's out there is the idea of a president. This is probably the most innovative idea of the Constitutional Convention. The idea that the people, whoever the people are, would elect the leader of the country. Again, we are coming out of a Western political tradition where everybody is ruled by a monarch. It might be a constitutional monarch like in England or an absolutist monarch like in France, but everybody is ruled by a monarch. The notion of electing your king, for example, is a very creative one. And not everybody is on board with this. Most people assume that the first president will be George Washington. And so there is a certain comfort level with that because he is universally admired. But there are some concerns as to who this person might be and how they're to be elected. Some people feel that everybody ought to vote for the president. Everybody ought to vote. Others say no, only very exclusive citizens, a small percentage who really know what they're doing, ought to vote. Others say Congress itself ought to vote. Because of this, we wind up with an electoral college. The Electoral College was essentially a compromise measure to try to give all these different viewpoints a piece of the pie and get them to agree. So in the Electoral College, as today, we all vote for president, all adults vote, but the actual voting for president is done by electors. And if there's ever not a unanimous winner or a majority winner, it goes into the Congress, which today rarely happens. It hasn't happened for about almost 200 years. But the assumption back then, before we had a two-party system that was clearly defined, was that after Washington, it would go into Congress all the time. So they figured Congress would make the final decision. So this was a way of getting everybody something they wanted, which was a key feature of the Constitutional Convention. If nothing else, what this convention has to do is agree amongst itself. They have got to put out something. They've already decided they're going to change the articles. They're going to eliminate those and come up with a new government. So if nothing else, they have to agree amongst themselves. And that's one of the advantages of the Constitution. One of the things that impresses me about this document is that you have a document that was created in 1787 when our country was vastly agrarian, when 90% of the people lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, when we had no military presence, we had no industry to speak of, we had no international presence whatsoever. And yet, that same government functions today when we're a nation of almost 300 million people, covering the continent. We're industrial power. We have a military and international presence that is around the world, and yet the same government works. And one of the reasons it does is that the original document left so many things unanswered that could be answered as time went on. Well, once they come up with this document, now we have to get it approved. That's the idea of ratification. In other words, once the convention finishes, they put this document out there. They need to get each of the states to agree to change from the Articles of Confederation to this Constitution. Not everybody, by the way, at the Constitutional Convention signed this. 3 delegates said they couldn't. But the majority did, and they put it out there. And in each state, a special ratifying convention is held to approve the Constitution. In some states, it's unanimous, but in most, it is hotly contested. Many thought that this new government had too much power, that the pendulum had swung from a powerful king and a powerful parliament to an Articles of Confederation, which was too weak, and rather than finding a middle ground, many people think it's gone too far. To help persuade them that the Constitution is a good idea, 3 men, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and most importantly, James Madison himself, write a series of newspaper articles, editorial pieces, if you will, to specifically help New York, the delegates of New York, decide to approve it. These become known as the Federalist Papers, and they are quickly spread around the other states. Because what the Federalist Papers do are give sort of an insider's argument on why the Constitution was written the way it was written. Okay, it's become one of a very important document in American history in and of itself. But these Federalist Papers help persuade very crucial states like New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and importantly Virginia to approve the Constitution. And that takes place over the next year or so, and the Constitution goes into effect in 1788 and begins by forming our first government.